Ladies and gentlemen, Europe is changing, a change that was not perhaps unexpected, but not so soon. The European Parliament elections, which wrapped up on Sunday last week, saw the centrist coalition remain in power, but the far-right parties making striking, forceful gains across the continent. The epicenter of this political earthquake was France. President Emmanuel Macron's opponent, Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party, got double the support of Macron's Renaissance Party, leading the French president to call for snap elections in the coming weeks. Not just France, Italy, Germany and Spain also had the far-right forces gaining substantial ground in these elections. The centre-right European People's Party, centre-left Socialists and Democrats, and the liberal Renew Europe are the three largest groups in the European Parliament. And when you add the pro-Europe Greens into that, the centre is by far the largest bloc. Of the 27 EU member states, 13 heads of government currently belong to European parties on the right. The gains for the hard right in the European parliamentary elections may seem modest in terms of numbers, but clearly they are significant. About 360 million people across 27 European nations voted in their respective countries for these elections. The turnout was the highest in 20 years at around 51% as per initial EU data. Now, Sunday's results do not show a dramatic or a sudden shift to the far right, but there's something more nuanced and gradual which is happening in Europe. The nucleus of European politics has been shifting. Why is this shift happening? How will it now shape not just European politics, but the EU's policies with respect to global challenges? Let's try and understand this on the show tonight. To talk more on this, I'm joined by Dr. Swasti Rao, Associate Fellow at the Manohar Parrikar IDSA Institute, and Mark Brolin, author and geopolitical strategist, is joining us. Good evening, namaskar to both of you. Thank you very much for speaking with us at Mirror Now. Mark, let me start with you. A substantial shift for the far-right parties, a substantial ground that has been gained by far-right parties. How do you see this really? What are the reasons that you would attribute to this shift?
Mentioning a word before about realignment and shift, I think we're seeing a reset in European politics, and it's not really what meets the eye, because the traditional parties, those who have been in power for a long time, they're trying to frame it as a traditional centrist versus the radicals, both on the right and the left, whereas this is very much a protest vote, and those voting against the centrist parties, they are seeing it as out of touch elite versus the people. And neither side really are in command right now. So we're saying we're sort of a as I mentioned before, realignment or moving towards a new equilibrium. And I think that will be a stalemate for a few years. And I think we can equivalent this with what is happening in the US with traditionalist Joe Biden, seeing as a bit dated. And then we have the angry populist in Trump. And this is actually the same sort of scenario playing out. And I think you can say that many voters are not feeling well represented by either side.
Okay, let me come to you, Dr. Swasti Rao. Mark says that this is an equilibrium that has perhaps been achieved, and it's going to be some sort of tightrope that has to be walked by both sides in the coming years. How do you see this really? And do you see the far right gaining more ground now, considering the external factors that have been influencing the European politics?
Right. Good evening to you, Shreya, and good evening, Mark. Well, I think we also need to put certain things in perspective for the Indian audience who are not aware of how the voting and how the parties actually get represented at the European Parliament level. So to your question first, Shreya, yes, the European Parliament, if you look at the Parliament, the far right parties are basically members of two blocs. The first one is the European Conservatives and the Reformists, where Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's Brothers of Italy kind of dominates. And the second bloc is the one called Identity and Democracy, where you have the Marine Le Pen's National Rally and Germany's Alternative for Deutschland, which is AFD. They dominated until recently. Now, on the one hand, you definitely have a surge of the votes, as in they have definitely polled more votes in their favor, far right by and large. But the problem is that the far right cannot really put up a united front because there is a rupture in the far right unity. And this rupture has happened because, like I said, that if you look at these two blocks that I just mentioned, the AfD, Alternative for Deutschland, that party got expelled by its other
Yeah.
members of the bloc because there were certain charges of espionage for China, and they were spying for China, and all those kind of scandals really came up, and they were expelled from the far right bloc. Because of that, yes, there is, and because of the fact that they are not able to come up as a united force, you probably see that they are not really able to sort of really be in that decisive, so to say, role. But having said that, the rise of the far right is very real, and where it reflects the most actually is in France, where you saw that Macron's Renaissance
Yeah.
party polled about 15%, whereas Marine Le Pen's party got about 30%, and that has forced France to call. Macron has called for snap elections. Now, the larger question is what really happens, because from an Indian perspective, then I think a lot of people in India are again not able to make sense of what really happens and why has Macron called for a snap election. So, in short, I think and I'm sure you're going to be asking that later, but this is a bit of I agree with Mark that this is a bit of a complicated scenario, but at the same time, you do expect a kind of a continuity, because if you look at the major bloc, the center left, the center right, and the liberals, the three main parties that form the European the main bloc, which actually whose leader is Ursula von der Leyen in many sense, right? Their vote share, I mean, their seats last 2019 they were at 430 something, and this particular election they have fallen to 407. So there's a loss of about 20-25 seats, and that's all. So that you would expect a continuity. But having said
Yeah.
that, the far right remains divided. If they were to join hands, and also later, this would be a challenge for where the Europeans are going in the future, and also for the future of the European project. Back to you.
Sure, of course, we'll have to see how this really moves forward. But Mark, Dr. Swasti mentioned a very important point, that of France. And perhaps the biggest setback has come to President Emmanuel Macron in this, calling for snap elections and Marine Le Pen's party gaining ground, winning. But, how do you see this really? How do you see this moving ahead for Macron? Is it due to his increasing anti-immigrant, anti-Islamic rhetoric that has affected him and his politics back home?
Well, that's one element of it, but I think also he might be thinking that he might be able to pull off some sort of a big surprise here, and I think he might be wrong about that. In the same way that it might have been a mistake of Sunak in the United Kingdom to call a snap election or a quick election. I think the forces against Macron are so strong now that he will face a heavy defeat. But then I agree with Dr. Swasti as well that this is the moment has not come yet for the right-wing parties. The centrist parties are still a majority in the European Parliament, but they are gaining momentum. And we saw a big thing happen today when talking in France, that one of the mainstream centrist right parties were saying they want to form an alliance with Le Pen. And that's a big thing, since the centrist parties has always before saying that they will never form an alliance with Le Pen. Just one point I think is also important here. You talked about rupture before, and that is a really interesting point as well, because I think some of these parties called right-wing parties, they are not so right-wing in some ways. If you take Le Pen's party, it's actually quite left-wing when it comes to economics, and I think that's one key reason they have. It's difficult for them to collude. So that's another point. I think that is not coming across when we always talk about far right. It's that I think that's a smear label sometimes.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's actually appropriate, but sometimes it's used for political reasons.
Yeah, which is also something, Dr. Swasti Rao, you could perhaps clarify for our viewers how we see far right here in India and how it really differs when we see it in European countries or in America even. Very stark differences between the two ideologies here and there.
I think what really the far right stands for in Europe, see, you have to understand a couple of things. So I told you that there is already a conservative bloc. Okay, so the conservative bloc is perhaps you would argue
Yeah.
that they would have more capitalist tendencies and they would not be so like a typical liberal or a center left bloc. But the far right has a different kind of a characteristic in Europe, which came into, so to say, force, or which started gaining support because of a certain thing that happened in 2015, 2016, which was the peaking of the refugee crisis. And because of the peaking of that refugee crisis, where after the Arab Spring turned to Arab winter, and you had the uncontrolled migration coming into Europe, European societies, and also changing so many cultural things and the societal things, and a whole host of things, and we have spoken about it earlier as well. You saw the rise in the far right, which started to capitalize on the European identity, that started to capitalize on closing down borders and immigration, etc., etc. Just a little bit of a difference that I'd like to highlight for the Indian viewers, because now you have in Europe, now when you say that the far right remains divided, it is not just about the fact that the AFD got expelled from the far right bloc. That's, of course, is one characteristic. There are other characteristics also. And I'll tell you what those other characteristics are. The fact is that they also remain divided on the question of European security and Ukraine and Russia. So, on the one hand, you have, raging, glorious far right performances by Giorgia Meloni and by Marine Le Pen, who are very, very pro-Ukraine, who are very, very, pro-European security. On the other hand, you have parties, for example, like Hungary's Viktor Orban's party, which is also a far-right party. Actually, that is a very pro-Russia party in Europe, which has perhaps had its worst electoral run this time in the elections. So what I'm saying is that these are the reasons that keeps the far right divided. And there's a third characteristic, an important one, which is that when you saw finally that in a country like Italy, where the far right finally formed a government, you saw that they had to tone down on their rhetoric of immigration, because Europe is a declining, so to say, the demographic is a demographic declining. It's an aging society. So when they are on the other side of the political divide, as in when they are in the opposition, then everybody is trying to rally support and the public sentiment
Yeah.
around closing down borders, etc. But when they actually form the governments, they kind of realize that they cannot really have that kind of a very dramatic stance on immigration. So that said, and then of course, Mark also clarified that if you look carefully in, like Marine Le Pen, so a lot of her
I
policies are
think, Dr.
actually
Swasti Rao, that's very prevalent with all political parties. The promises and the rhetoric that is done while campaigning, and then when you assume power, it becomes very different, and you know the realities and the considerations that you have to work around with when you're in power. But Mark, let me also quickly ask you, it was disappointing for the Greens group also. How do you see that really, that declining role of the Greens political group, perhaps the wars, the post-COVID era, the illegal immigration, the cost of living crisis, all of that has it at all contributed to, a decreasing concern for the environment?
Well, not really, but I think it has. I think the Green parties might have peaked in the sense that this was so strongly tied to the energy crisis as well. And I think since there was the trade-offs were not clearly specified a few years back, so it was moving in a direction which was perhaps a bit too hyped. And closing down nuclear power plants, many people have regretted that now. And then when they were not talking about the Russian dependence on Russian oil, all this sort of is tied together. So I think that perhaps the Green parties, they took things a little bit too far, not talking about the trade-offs, and people have been a little bit turned off by that. So I think possibly they have peaked, but I would not say at all that the concern about environment is less so. But I think much of the green agenda has been triangulated by the other parties. So that's also one reason why the Green parties themselves have lost votes.
All right, we'll leave it there. Mark Brolin and Dr.
I think
Swasti Rao, thank you very much. Let's see. Yeah, quickly, 20 seconds, Mark.
I just want to add this thing that I think we have both talked about, all three of us. I think that still no party, either side is actually really capturing what European voters really want. And that's why I think we're moving towards the equilibrium has not been reached yet. So I think after a while, we might be able to find someone who is sort of in middle, bit more democratic and less secure, those security concerns as Dr. Swasti mentioned before. I think no side has really captured the sentiment of European voters. And that's why we are in a turmoil right now in Europe.
Okay. Well, clearly it's the era of coalitions. Mark, here in India, we have a coalition government. Let's see how it works in the European Union Parliament as well. We'll leave it there. Dr. Swasti Rao and Mark Brolin, thank you very much to both of you for joining us on Nation Tonight and sharing your perspectives and helping us better understand this. Thank you very much.